Some days, life has a way of teaching you a lesson before you even know the danger is coming. That Saturday was supposed to be ordinary. I had planned a small barbecue in my backyard, a weekend ritual for me and my friends. The sun was out, the smell of smoked meat hung in the air, and my kids were running around in the grass, laughing without a care. It was ordinary, peaceful. Ordinary was dangerous. I had lived in this suburban neighborhood for 5 years. Quiet streets, white picket fences, the kind of place where neighbors smiled politely but never crossed paths beyond the mailbox. I'd always kept to myself, never bothered anyone, never needed to, until that day. I was flipping burgers on the grill when I noticed the Hendersons across the street staring. Mr. Henderson, middle-aged, pinched lips, arms crossed. His wife hovered behind him, holding a small dog, her eyes squinting at me like I had done something criminal by merely existing. I waved. Nothing. I shrugged and went back to the grill. A moment later, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a phone dialing. "You're joking," I muttered, but I was. Minutes later, lights flashed in the distance. Red and blue, my heart skipped. Police. I didn't panic. Not immediately. I walked calmly to the front of the yard as the cars stopped at the curb. My friends froze mid-laughter. Kids looked up from their games. I raised my hands politely as the officers stepped out. "Good afternoon, officers," I said. They nodded, professional, calm, but they didn't look at me with suspicion. Not yet. Then the reality hit me. The Hendersons had called the cops on a black man having a barbecue in his own backyard. "Hi," I said, keeping my tone light. "Is there a problem?" The taller officer, neatly pressed uniform, hat perfectly straight, paused. Then something happened that made my heart stop. He saluted me. My friends froze. My kids blinked. Mr. Henderson's mouth opened slightly like he had seen a ghost. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. The officers didn't just treat me politely, they recognized me, not as a suspect, not as a troublemaker. As the salute ended, I realized the truth. I had spent years in the military reserves, honorably serving. My uniform may have been out of sight that day, but my record was. Respect followed me even when the ignorance of neighbors tried to erase it. Mr. Henderson was frozen. His lips moved silently, words failing him. The officers turned to him. Then the punchline, "You called us because," one of the officers asked softly, almost kindly. What followed was awkward silence. I could see it in every neighbor who had watched from behind curtains. Their judgment had been loud. Their whispers had carried. And now, everything they had assumed was crumbling. My friends were laughing nervously. I chuckled once, the sound dry. Humiliation is best answered with calm confidence. "You see," I said finally to no one in particular, "sometimes people forget that respect is earned, not assumed, and just because you think someone doesn't belong doesn't mean they don't." By the end of the day, the barbecue went on. Officers stayed long enough to chat, shake hands, and even compliment the grill. But the lesson had been delivered subtly, powerfully. Humiliation, theirs this time, had a taste of poetic justice. Still, this was only the beginning. Because what started as a simple act of ignorance would soon spiral into a story no one in the neighborhood could have predicted. A story that would expose decades of assumptions, prejudice, and secrets. And the next part would be far darker. The police had left, but the tension lingered like smoke in the air. My friends tried to joke, but the laughter was hollow. The kids were quiet now, sensing the weight in the adults' voices. And me, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, because in neighborhoods like this, ignorance doesn't stay quiet for long. By the next morning, the calls started, anonymous texts, subtle threats, passive-aggressive comments left on the neighborhood app. "We don't appreciate late-night noise," one read. Another, "Certain people don't belong here." I stared at the screen, hands clenched. My skin prickled. I had faced judgment before in schools, in workplaces, even in uniform. But this was personal. I wanted to ignore it, walk away, pretend the Hendersons and their ilk didn't exist. But that's not who I was, not anymore. Later that week, a neighborhood meeting was called. I had no choice but to attend. The Hendersons were there, their faces tight with disapproval. I felt every eye in the room like a weight pressing against my chest. I could see them whispering, murmuring behind hands. Glances shot my way that screamed, "What is he doing here? How dare he stand among us?" And then the microphone was passed to me. I took a deep breath. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady. "I understand some of you have concerns about last weekend." They snickered, not loud but enough to sting. "I had a barbecue in my own backyard for my friends, my children, my family, and apparently that was unacceptable to some." I paused. Let them simmer in the discomfort for a moment. Let the weight of their own ignorance start to press on them. "You called the police," I said, and every head turned. "Not for a threat, not for danger, but because I exist as a black man in this neighborhood." The room went silent. I continued, slowly, deliberately. "I served this country. I wore a uniform. I risked my life for people who probably don't even know my name. And yet, somehow, my mere presence was seen as suspicious, humiliating, dangerous, for existing." A woman in pearls scoffed. Another muttered something under her breath. I didn't flinch. "You thought you were protecting something by calling the cops, but the truth is you were protecting your own prejudice." By the end of my speech, eyes were on me, not hostile anymore, but unsettled, confused. The officers who had come that day had seen my service record, saluted me, and now the truth was clear. I had dignity they couldn't erase. Still, the story wasn't finished. Because power often hides in numbers. And I knew the Hendersons would not quietly accept their humiliation. They would scheme, whisper, plot, and that's when it happened. The twist that would change everything. The next Saturday, while I was preparing for another small gathering in my backyard, they came prepared. The real test wasn't about me grilling meat anymore. It was about exposing who they truly were and proving, once and for all, that humiliation can be reversed. This is where the stakes rise, the neighbors' envy and fear escalate, and the audience is kept on edge. The following Saturday started like any other. Sun bright, the smell of charcoal and smoked meat floating through the air. My kids ran circles around the backyard, squealing and laughing, completely oblivious to the storm brewing beyond our fences. I had just flipped the first burger when I noticed them. The Hendersons and their allies had arrived early. Not walking casually this time, they stood at the edge of the yard, arms crossed, faces set in rigid scowls. Their whispers carried across the lawn like cold wind, sharp and cutting. I tried to ignore them. I wanted to focus on my family, but my body tensed anyway. I knew humiliation when it approached. And then the doorbell rang. A sharp, official sound. I opened the gate to see two police cars parked curbside, lights flashing silently, the neighborhood watching. My stomach sank. My first thought was, here we go again. But this time, the officers stepped out differently. They approached with respectful composure, not suspicion. My heart began to steady. Then I saw their hands, not a handshake, not a glance, but a formal salute. My friends froze mid-laughter. The Hendersons went pale. Mr. Henderson's jaw slackened. Their whispers died instantly. It was surreal. Silence so thick it could be felt. The officer in charge spoke clearly, loudly enough for the neighbors to hear. "Sir, we received a call about a disturbance. There is none. You are free to conduct your gathering." Then, almost casually, he added, "We are aware of your service. We salute you." The effect was immediate: shock, awe, humiliation. The very same people who had thought themselves morally superior now realized their ignorance had been exposed. I didn't say anything. I simply returned to the grill, keeping my tone calm, dignified. My friends relaxed slightly. My kids ran back to me, oblivious to the tension that had erupted around them. The neighbors, however, they lingered awkwardly, watching, realizing, their sense of superiority crumbling in real time. But the real twist hadn't come yet. Because humiliation, when turned around, has layers. And the story wasn't just about a black man at a barbecue anymore. It was about the truth they had ignored for years. You see, one of my friends had recorded the earlier interactions, the Hendersons' complaints, the whispers, the moments they looked down at me like I was lesser. And now that recording was about to go public. Within hours, the neighborhood WhatsApp group was flooded. Videos circulated showing Mr. Henderson glaring at me, his wife whispering to neighbors about how unwelcome I was, the police arriving, saluting me, leaving the Hendersons frozen. The reaction: total shock. Suddenly, the balance had shifted. The watchers became the watched. Neighbors whispered nervously among themselves. Kids stared curiously. And the Hendersons, they had nowhere to hide. I finally spoke to them calmly without raising my voice. "Gentlemen, you've spent all week thinking you could intimidate me, that you could humiliate me. But the truth," I paused, letting my words sink in. "The truth always finds a way to speak louder than fear." And that's when it happened. A knock at the gate. This time, not police. Not friends. But the media, someone from a local news station, had seen the clips circulating online and arrived to cover the story. Cameras, microphones, lights. The Hendersons scrambled, trying to hide their faces. Their whispers turned to panic. Their looks of judgment turned into silent horror. The humiliation they had tried to inflict on me was now reflected back at them, amplified tenfold. And the barbecue, it continued. Laughter, joy, the smell of smoked meat filling the air. But now, the air also carried vindication, justice, and the quiet strength of someone who had refused to bow to prejudice. By Monday morning, the video had spread like wildfire. Notifications pinged relentlessly. My phone vibrated in a constant rhythm, each one a reminder that the world had seen what had happened at my backyard barbecue. I hadn't expected this. I had only wanted to live my life quietly, to enjoy the weekend with my kids and friends. But sometimes, life has a way of giving justice without asking permission. The neighborhood group chat exploded. Messages poured in, not in whispers this time, but outright panic. People who had turned their noses up at me were now facing the undeniable truth. "Did you see the video? I can't believe it. He served in the military." And at the very center of it all, Mr. Henderson's face stared back at me through the clips, frozen in horror. That evening, I decided it was time to step outside. I walked to the edge of my yard, waving politely at neighbors as they peeked nervously from behind curtains. And then I heard the knock. Not at my gate, at the Hendersons' door. I waited, curious. A moment later, a small delegation appeared, the police, the local news crew, and a few community leaders. Their presence was polite but firm. They carried cameras, microphones, and official letters. One of the officers spoke first. "Mr. Henderson, we've received reports of harassment and discriminatory behavior. We need to address this immediately." Mr. Henderson opened his mouth, stammering. His wife tugged at his sleeve. The neighbors who had laughed behind their hands now looked down at the ground. Silence stretched across the street, heavy and uncomfortable. I stepped forward calmly. The cameras caught my every move. "Good evening," I said, voice steady. "I hope this gathering finds you well." I wanted everyone to understand something simple. Dignity is not given, it is recognized, and respect is never optional. The effect was instantaneous. The Hendersons' bravado crumbled, replaced with the kind of shame that words cannot fix. But the twist, the part that would leave the neighborhood gasping in disbelief, had yet to be revealed. I pulled out a small stack of papers, legal documents, verification of my military service, awards, letters of commendation, certificates of training, everything they could never have imagined about me. "Because of ignorance," I said slowly, letting the words hang in the air, "you thought I was someone who could be intimidated, someone who didn't belong here. You called the police, trying to make me smaller, and now the world knows the truth." I handed copies of the documents to the local reporter who began broadcasting live. The Hendersons' faces turned bright red. Their whispers turned to stammers. Then came the final blow. The community leader stepped forward solemnly. "Because of your complaints, officers visited the wrong conclusion. Not once but twice. And now, because of your actions, you will publicly apologize and attend a diversity and inclusion training, effective immediately." Shock, humiliation, panic, their privilege had evaporated like smoke in the wind. I didn't gloat. I didn't shout. I simply watched, calm and steady, as the people who had sought to humiliate me were now being held accountable. The irony was poetic, the justice silent but unmistakable. The barbecue continued that evening. Friends laughed, children ran through the yard, the smell of grilled meat rising into the evening air. But now, each laugh carried a quiet echo, vindication, dignity restored, and the knowledge that prejudice has consequences. The next morning, I woke to a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. The neighborhood was quiet, the sun streaming gently across my backyard. But the memory of the previous weekend, the humiliation, the judgment, the fear still lingered like a shadow. I had always known that dignity could be tested, but now I realized something else. Truth has a way of shining through, even in the darkest moments. As I walked to the gate, my phone buzzed again. Another news alert. The reporter who had covered the incident was back with a follow-up story. This time, it wasn't just about me. It was about systemic injustice, assumptions, and accountability in the community. I clicked the link. My heart raced. The video of my barbecue had gone viral. The hashtags were trending locally: Respect Black Lives, Backyard Hero, Dignity Matters. Comments poured in. People who had never spoken to me before were messaging, "I'm so sorry for what your neighbors did." Thank you for showing strength and courage. You're an example of how dignity and truth always win. Even some of the Hendersons' friends reached out privately, ashamed. Then came the most unexpected twist of all, a knock at my door. I opened it to see a young man I didn't recognize, neatly dressed, holding a formal envelope. "Hi," he said politely. "I'm a representative from the city council. I wanted to personally thank you for demonstrating courage and integrity." And he hesitated. "I've been authorized to present this." He handed me a letter. I unfolded it. My eyes widened. It was a commendation from the city council, a recognition of my service, my integrity, and my courage in standing up against prejudice. The words burned in my chest. For demonstrating exemplary dignity and fortitude in the face of public humiliation and systemic bias, the city honors you as a model citizen, inspiring our community toward justice and respect. I sank into a chair, the envelope trembling in my hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same people who tried to humiliate me had unknowingly sparked a movement, a public acknowledgement of what they had denied. The Hendersons, meanwhile, were facing consequences of their own. Letters from the city, required community workshops. Their social standing diminished. Even their children, who had watched the events unfold, had learned an uncomfortable lesson about privilege and assumption. That evening, as my kids ran through the yard laughing and friends gathered to celebrate quietly, I realized something deeper. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't just about the barbecue or the viral video. It was about the power of self-respect. About holding your ground without anger, without malice, but with dignity so strong it cannot be shaken. And then the final twist. As I was cleaning the grill, my neighbor across the street, someone I had never spoken to, came over. She was older, her eyes kind and her voice gentle. "I wanted to tell you," she said softly, "I've lived here for decades. I've seen how people like the Hendersons operate, and I wanted to apologize. I should have said something sooner." Her words were simple, but they carried weight. Not every victory comes with public accolades. Some victories are measured in the courage to face discomfort, the humility to admit mistakes, and the quiet acknowledgement of truth. I nodded, understanding. And for the first time in years, I felt a true sense of closure. The morning sun spilled gently across the street, casting long, golden beams over the neighborhood. For the first time in weeks, it felt like peace had returned. Not just for me, but for my family, my friends, and even the quiet corners of the community that had watched us from a distance. I stepped outside, coffee in hand, and watched my children run across the yard. Their laughter rang clear and untainted, a sound I had longed for during those tense, humiliating days. Every giggle reminded me why I had stood my ground, why I had refused to bow to fear or prejudice. The Hendersons were quiet that morning. No taunts, no whispers, no stares. They had been made aware of the consequences of their actions. Letters from the city, public acknowledgement of my service, and social accountability had stripped them of their false sense of superiority. It wasn't revenge. It was truth and dignity prevailing over ignorance and privilege. Later, the local news ran a follow-up story. Footage of the barbecue, my speech, and the officer's salute aired again. But this time, the focus shifted. It wasn't about the humiliation I had suffered. It was about justice, courage, and accountability. Interviews poured in from neighbors and community members who had witnessed the events, all praising the strength, poise, and integrity I had shown. Even those who had once sneered at me had to admit the world had seen the truth. The biggest surprise came that evening. A small crowd gathered in my backyard. Not protesters, not critics, but neighbors who had once looked down on me, now offering apologies and gestures of goodwill. Some brought baked goods. Others simply stood and nodded, respect in their eyes. I welcomed them. I forgave them. Not because I owed it to anyone, but because healing starts with the heart, not the scoreboard. And then the final twist, the one that even I hadn't anticipated. The local mayor, having followed the story closely, appeared personally at my gate. Flanked by reporters, cameras, and a small entourage, he handed me a certificate. On behalf of the city, he said, we recognize your courage, your integrity, and your unwavering commitment to truth. You have set an example for every citizen here, and we hope your story inspires others to confront injustice with dignity. The audience clapped. My children cheered. Friends hugged me. And even some of the Hendersons, standing quietly at the back, nodded their heads in reluctant acknowledgement. I looked around at my yard, the children running, the friends smiling, the neighbors reflecting, and realized something profound. This victory wasn't just about me. It was about every person who has been judged unfairly, humiliated for existing, and doubted for their skin color. It was about strength, courage, and the refusal to let prejudice define your life. I took a deep breath and smiled. The barbecue smoke mingled with the golden sunset, a perfect symbol of triumph after struggle. I had faced humiliation. I had faced judgment. I had faced ignorance. And I had emerged stronger, respected, and finally heard. That evening, as the stars appeared over the quiet suburban street, I whispered to my children, always stand tall, always speak truth. And remember, courage is not the absence of fear, it is moving forward despite it. And with that, I knew the story had come full circle, not with anger, not with revenge, but with dignity, courage, and justice.